including David Schofield, who I think can draw some of the strands together. So I'm going to hand over to you, David, to take over for this section. David.
Sure. Thank you, John, and welcome back, everyone, from the different breakout groups you've all been in. What I want to do, in fact, is to invite our two breakout room hosts on the Zoom side, that's Andy and Jose, to give a report as to what went on in their groups. And perhaps, Jose, I can start with you, and you could give us, perhaps in a few minutes, the key points that your group talked about in terms of the situation for our corporate guests today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. So I think on question one, which was what changes might we see in the future around global mobility program structure, policies and benefits, I think probably one of the key things that we focused on was probably new global mobility policy design. And we focused quite a lot on this concept of virtual assignments, whereby individuals maybe stay located in their, let's say, their home country, but carry out an assignment on behalf of another entity, which I think we all recognise is something we've kind of heard of and has been around, but we probably haven't necessarily been very involved in setting these up and understanding, well, what does it mean from a compliance perspective, a virtual working perspective, etc., etc. So Emery made some very interesting comments from Unilever around agreeing that virtual assignments had really come to the fore over the last few weeks, and a requirement to really look at the compliance assessments around them. So from a corporate tax, immigration structure, looking at, asking wider questions around which entities benefiting from the work and these kinds of things. And when we discussed, do we see this as a short-term fix, perhaps, as borders remain closed and obtaining visas continues to be difficult, I think the feeling was it's likely to be a longer-term requirement to really assess the need for these types of virtual assignments as an alternative to the traditional moves, and hence really building up much more structure and framework around these to enable proper planning and these kinds of things. Ben from ICON, Ben Carter, was also mentioning around what he's seen as a number of new policy design inquiries from clients, which I thought was interesting, and some larger clients wanting more bespoke service arrangements as well. So we didn't touch on that in a huge amount of detail, but I think perhaps with things like high touch becoming important from an employee well-being perspective, really looking at service delivery model to understand, well, look, are there enough touch points? Is well-being of assignees' families being properly catered for, and should we be re-looking at those models going forward?
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, that makes sense. Did you get any ideas from the people in your room about really radical changes? Anyone talking about major threats to mobility programs generally? Because the tone so far in this meeting has been very upbeat, I'm glad to say. I just wondered if there are any voices of real concern out there.
No, none, and we probably didn't discuss that point, but I think probably there is. We have to accept there's a challenge to the traditional long-term assignment model, but at the same time, these alternative forms of mobility, arguably are as complex or even more complex, and the skill set that global mobility needs to bring to navigate the challenges are, I think, equally as complex. So I think there's many opportunities for mobility to demonstrate value and assist the organisation, albeit in slightly different forms.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jose. Andy, perhaps I can turn to you just to pick up first on anything you want to add to that in terms of addressing that first theme about likely changes in programme structure and policies, and then we'll perhaps move on to the other question about how GM teams will operate in the future.
Yeah, I think the thing that came out from my group was an element of industry specific and how talent is deployed, and the objectives of deploying talent. So Brigitte of Doka construction company based out of Austria, their talent at the moment is very much concentrated in the mothership and headquarters, and therefore assignments are used to deploy these experts into the locations. And what they've realised, what is accelerated, is a known problem, which is actually that knowledge should reside much more and be established much more strongly in each location. So therefore, it's less almost about assignments and more about a culture of knowledge transfer and knowledge and where it's located and how you get it into these locations. So that was interesting. But then equally supported by Mark Salis, who works within the IT sector, Congressman, what he said was, look, like DOCA, we'll always need certain specialists to go in at a certain moment in time. These are just skills that reside in a person who coincidentally is in a certain location, and that won't change. So therefore, there will be a need for assignment types. But what they both said, which was very interesting, was there'll be more questions asked before an assignment is deployed. There'll be really, really rigorous, as going through a lot of tests, check and challenge, and then once you know that, that's when it'll happen. Cost containment will be a factor, either opportunistically or just as a matter of fact. But as we know, the rule of thumb, assignments are expensive, so questioning that again. With some great inputs from Ginevra of UI, who said, obviously she's an expert in deployment, but she's also part of a program, and she remains very optimistic about the need for mobility, like Jose's group. People need to be deployed, and that's very much the kind of the view of UI.
And actually, can I ask you then, Andy, to move it on, maybe building on that, in terms of, did you get any feel in your group for how GM teams themselves might have to be operating differently, organize themselves differently in future? Because we talked about how programs will change. What about the teams?
So where we kind of got to with this debate was, it was almost what I would describe as GM transformation, sort of phase 2. All the themes are the same that we've heard in the last 10, 15 years about, utilising technology and becoming even more strategic in outlook and understanding and contribution. Because as Jose says, short-term deployment is arguably, and pulling people in and out on a short-term basis is arguably more complex than a more traditional long-term assignment. So suddenly the skill set remains valid. Where I would like to have steered a discussion, and we've had it at time, was, do we actually think the role of GM will be GM? Will we have this kind of transformed talent deployment, talent acquisition, talent management / GM hybrid roles going forward, where GM might not exist in itself per se, but it'll be such a key part of another role, and those other roles will have to be able to handle the technicality of that. So often you talk talent acquisition, they're great at a certain thing, but I wouldn't say all of the GM skills are their strengths. But maybe your starting point is the GM person who becomes a talent acquisition person or a talent deployer.
I guess, Andy, that brings us back to one of the things we said at the start about making an advantage of this crisis and building towards this more strategic role for GM that we talked about, to be honest, in these forums for a long time. Andy, thanks for that. Just conscious of the time here. Jose, I just wondered if there's anything more you wanted to add from your group about future organisation of GM teams.
Maybe just a couple of quick points. So Jacqueline raised some interesting points around a potential shift in the mindset around, much more flexibility of how people work, when, and hopefully a view that there would be more acceptance of people working maybe a bit more independently as a product of the current situation. And we discussed around, perhaps with things like quiz nights and game evenings, are people comfortable about this kind of blurring of the boundaries between kind of work and social? So there was some interesting views on that. And there was a view from Emery from Unilever that actually she didn't see a huge change in terms of the structure of teams as a result of the current crisis. How working works. I think it's maybe around continuing to have a tolerance for ambiguity, and that's always something that we've been very used to having. Indeed.
Andy, Jose, thanks very much indeed for bringing those insights back into the whole meeting. I think what we'd like to try and do in the next 5 minutes or so is bring together the main themes from this whole event. We've covered an awful lot of ground, amazingly, in an hour and 10 minutes. It's the amount of things we've covered has been very impressive. Could I turn to Ben maybe first and then to Michael? I know you guys have not only been participating, but you've been helping by making a note of what you see as the maybe one or two key themes that have emerged out of this whole event. Ben, could you highlight one or two key messages that you're taking away from this yourself?
Absolutely. So technically, from observing the whole thing, I mean, research-wise, I feel like a kid in a candy store. It's been really interesting. There's so many things going on. If I have to summarize two key points from the earlier part of this whole session, I think duty of care is one of the most important things we need to be looking at in terms of what has been done so far and how it can be adapted. And the other underlying theme is probably digitization, anything related to that, how to manage people, leadership, how to manage processes and everything. And what I think is really, really interesting to take away, and that pretty much relates to what I think Andy said, what's complex and how you can deal with that. I think every company needs to look at everything that's relevant from the question, is it complex or is it complicated? Because these are two different things. And differentiating between complex things and complicated things and how they can be managed will probably be very, very crucial in the future. And then to reiterate what I stated before, GM needs to get away from reactive to proactive, because this crisis has a lot of opportunities.
Okay, but that makes sense, and that's consistently coming through. Michael, your views on key takeaways from today.
Conscious of time, so thanks, Ben, for picking up some really important points. This was a really exciting session, like a kid in the candy store, you said, Ben. This was really nice. Let me just add one, therefore, and that was Mark's point, which struck a chord with me: mobility of people versus mobility of work, because we really linked to that in many of the sessions, whether it was talking about virtual work and the more trust and flexibility we need, or anything like that. So my thing about why do we have mobility and how will we structure it, that's connected to this mobility of people versus mobility of work idea.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And that really is a very fundamental point. And we were getting today, I think, at some really